Hello, and welcome to the Swiss Money Secrets podcast, presented to you by WHVP. WHVP is a company that has been helping Americans move assets outside of the US for over 30 years. In this podcast, the listeners can expect to hear on subjects pertaining to offshore investment and investing outside of the US markets and the US dollar. Now, let's get into it. So, welcome back, listeners, and Jamie and Urs, back to the Swiss Money Secrets podcast. Finally, we're with the team again. It's been a while since we're all together for the podcast. I'm really excited to be talking today about the cash initiative that is happening in Switzerland right now, which we'll get onto a little bit later. We all talked before the podcast that we wanted to quickly cover the news topic that's obviously trending in the United States. It's been blown up. I mean, it is a serious issue, something we've beat over the head as far as a topic enough with what we talk about, and that's the U.S. debt limit that is currently being hashed out between the political parties in the U.S. It's quite interesting to see. We've had these before in the United States history. I mean, in my lifetime, I think we've had it about 2 or 3 times. That I can remember. Again, I was a kid for one of them, and then a teenager who didn't really care and wasn't paying attention for the other ones. But it's interesting to see that it's coming to a head. And I remember the last time it was being talked about was when the U.S. had $16 trillion worth of debt. And now we're about to be double that, and having the next one within 15 years. So that's pretty interesting for me to think about how they've continued to expand the debt. They find their political differences and then raise the debt ceiling. And so maybe you guys could give your thoughts, what you guys have been seeing, I guess, from the outside perspective, from the Swiss perspective, on what you see about that situation that's developing in the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting to follow these developments and also to see how different countries react, because debt break, or debt ceiling, it does exist in several jurisdictions, but the way how it is dealt with is very different. And I mean, we do have a debt break here in Switzerland, and the discussion is if you overshoot your debt ceiling, how can you reduce your spendings or your expenses, instead of how can we increase the debt ceiling. And so in Switzerland, it's a percentage of the BIP. And if the politicians spend too much money, they have to come up with a plan how they can reduce their expenses so that it is sustainable. And on the other hand, you have the US, where every time we hear about this issue, it's always a discussion about, how can we make it possible for us to spend even more to increase the debt ceiling? So that doesn't seem very sustainable to me.
Just to add quickly, I think a BIP is the German abbreviation, so that would be GDP.
Sorry.
Just to be clear for our listeners, so yeah, it's a percentage of the GDP of Switzerland. And I think for me, I mean, I see it very similar to Urs. I'm just fascinated by how many things are politicized in the US, whereas here in Switzerland, it is much less of a political talking point or like a leverage against another party or something like that. It's I think looked at it more mathematically, more from a financial standpoint, and that is what I believe is the more sustainable approach, to have it limited and actually adhere to those limits and not negotiate more spending every time the money runs out.
Yeah, I think it's, as Urs had mentioned, in the US, it's always, how can we increase the debt ceiling to spend more? And the political arguments as an American, it gets very politicized. And it's interesting to see that, because it's never about, we're going to stop spending, we're not going to spend more, we're really going to reduce our spending. It's fighting on a few points of saying, yeah, we want to reduce our spending in this area, but increase spending here. And so both parties are going for their various reasons, but it's both are still wanting to spend more. I mean, we see that when you look at the budget that the White House puts out every year, and their forecasts are sky high. Sky's the limit when it comes to debt and the deficit spending that they're planning on doing in the future up to 2050. I think is they have their budget projections posted at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, we also see that in the actual numbers, right? I mean, Switzerland has a debt to GDP ratio of around 40% because of the ceiling that we take seriously. And in the US, we have about 140% of the GDP, and that is way beyond what is sustainable in terms of levels of debt that a country should take on.
Yeah,
and I think also like the seriousness of this always increasing is not present with a lot of politicians because they are biased from the past. I mean, looking back to the last 12 years, I would say from 2010 onwards, I mean, the growth in GDP was so high that it worked out. It wasn't really an issue. But looking ahead of us, there are quite a few signs which tell us that the growth in GDP might not be as high as anymore as it was, and that could be a huge issue when it comes to that.
Yeah, and it's one thing I really like when I was learning about the Swiss system when I first came here, and the debt break that Switzerland has, where I think it's about 43% is where they say, okay, here's the hard cutoff line, and so we need to stay below that. I think that percentage, that debt break, really enables the government to be much more efficient in assuring the allocation is being spent on what's supposed to be spent. Because if it's just sliding around and they lose track of it, I mean, they would end up in a situation like the United States where they're just trying to continually raise the debt ceiling. Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting. I think it'll be really valuable for our listeners to hear your guys' perspective on that, kind of from an outside opinion of how you guys see that. Yeah, so I think now we can move on to our topic of this episode, which is the cash initiative that's being brought forward to the Swiss people potentially. Maybe Urs, you can lead us into explaining what this cash initiative is. I mean, our listeners, Americans, have probably never heard of what this is or even how direct democracy might work in Switzerland. So maybe you can give some background into what's happening.
Yeah, sure. So in Switzerland, I mean, as everywhere in the world during Corona, there was a lot of discussions about like moving more into digital payments and getting rid of cash more and more. And that is something which people could also see in the behavior of central banks, where they did some research how they could introduce central bank digital currencies. It's a huge issue, or a huge term. And so there was a group of people in Switzerland that they said, we don't want that. We want to be sure that for the future that we will always have the choice between what we use, whether it's cash or whether it's like a credit card or whatever. And so they came up with a referendum to make sure that we can implement that into our constitution. In Switzerland, it works in a way that you have to collect signatures from about 100,000 people, and then they have to be brought in front of a judge who makes sure that everything's right, every signature is valid, and then this referendum goes to the government, and they have to turn it into an election where the people in Switzerland can decide whether they want to have this step taken on to implement this guarantee of cash into our constitution.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We have democracy in the United States, but not at that straight level, which is, I think, is really something that's fascinating. That really helps Switzerland be unique in the world when you look at the how the government is run on federal level as well. I mean, there are some states in the U.S. that have portions of direct democracy at the local levels, at the state, but Switzerland really, I mean, down to the lowest level has that. And I think it's really interesting because smaller groups of people can bring forward referendums. 100,000 people in a country of 8 million is relatively small percentage. And so I think that's quite interesting. Jamie, maybe you could give us, I guess, some background of why this is so important, or kind of how the Swiss might view this referendum moving forward, and why you, I guess, even from a personal standpoint, what you kind of think about this referendum that might be brought forward to the Swiss people.
Sure. I think on like a broad level, and we have spoken about that before when we were preparing this podcast, Switzerland is quite a conservative country in a lot of aspects, and cash payment is one of them. So I was quite surprised actually to see the actual numbers. I knew that the cash was quite prevalent here, but I've read that 97% of Swiss people still use cash or have cash at home. And over 70%, I believe, of the transactions are made in cash. So especially for people who are 55 years old and older, this is still the most popular means of payment. And I think, for me personally, I think it is important to have the option to pay with cash. I have to admit that I pay cashless most of the time, but I like to have the option. I don't think that the government should take this right away from people. I mean, it is a very slippery slope into a huge loss of privacy. The potential of surveillance is huge, and I think that's always something to be careful of. This particular initiative or referendum, I think personally, I think it's good that we have direct democracy. I think it's good that we are able to put those referendums forward. And I think this specific case, they collected over 160,000 signatures in the 18-month time limit that they had, which definitely means it should be taken seriously as a way forward in politics. I personally don't think it's currently really necessary because yes, the fears are here from some people, but again, like if 97% of people use cash and have cash, I'm not sure if there is an actual need today to write it into the constitution, but if a majority of Swiss people feel that it is necessarily, why not do it? And I mean, it might be a necessity some point down the road, so why not make those rules now? I think also not just from like a population standpoint or a general public standpoint, also the central bank here in Switzerland itself seems to be quite in favor of cash because they have come out several times in the past where they said, well, we do believe in the people's right to use cash. We don't have a problem with cash. We don't have any immediate plans to take cash away from people. And as far as I know, our central bank is also not looking into the options of creating a central bank digital currency compared to like the US, for example, where President Biden issued an executive order a little over a year ago to look into the benefits and threats of having a CBDC in the States. So I think Switzerland is a bit slow to adapt sometimes, is again quite conservative. So I don't think that there's an immediate threat to cash here. So I'm not sure if the referendum really is needed. But I mean, why not? If that's a worry of people and we can take this worry away from them by voting on the topic, why not? The only issue I see is that currently this referendum is only being carried by individual people. I mean, 160,000 are a lot, but still to get things going, you usually need support from some of the major parties here. So we have 7 relevant parties, and typically several of them should support a referendum like that for it to have or get a majority support in the population. But who knows, it's possible that some of the more right-leaning parties are going to support it. That's something that is to be seen.
What do you think, what would be the argument against it? I guess if to play devil's advocate against the cash initiative, why would this even become, I guess, a political issue if like Jamie said, 97% of Swiss people have or use cash or have it on them? I guess could there be a mindset that's there to say let's get rid of cash?
I mean, there definitely could be a mindset, but as Jamie said, I don't think that it's very present in Switzerland, but I think that it's a good thing that it happens because it shows people care. And I mean, at the current stage, it doesn't change anything. And so I think it's good to plan ahead and say, okay, now we have the facts, nothing really threatens us, but we want to have this discussion, so let's put that in our constitution. And I think it's a very basic demand they have. It's not like a specific one where they have, okay, it has to be like 2 trillion in Swiss francs, have to be like physically around all the time or something like that. It's really, as far as I understand so far, it's really about we want to have cash, we want to have the guarantee that over the time we will have the options whether we use cash or not.
Yeah.
I think also in a time where cyber attacks and like digital risks are so very much on the rise, it also makes sense to have cash as an option if there's electricity issues, if there's a hacker attack, some other sort of cybersecurity issue. I think that's also something where you just give people a little bit more peace of mind because they are less dependent on technology and electricity. And I think that's also a good thing. Again, like how much people actually use it in the day-to-day, I don't know. I think it is a trend that people are just using cash less and less, especially the younger ones, just because of convenience reasons. But I think it's good to also plan for worst case scenarios where cash would still be very much the easier and better option.
Yeah, and I think what I really, again, as someone who can't vote on it, what I like about the initiative is it doesn't say, from what I understand of reading, it doesn't say we don't want a digital currency, we only want cash. It's simply just saying we want cash, and we're fine with whatever happens as long as we can have cash as an option. And for me, I think that kind of sets a nice boundary or a starting line, I guess you could say, for Switzerland to really develop. I mean, we see already in Zug that the residents of Zug can pay their taxes in Bitcoin. So there's still a lot of innovation happening in Switzerland and looking into other payment options or even other currencies to deal with things. And I think keeping all the options in something that's quite valuable. I guess people, as you had mentioned, this initiative comes from a conservative party that's being pushed it. I read that
it's not coming from a party.
It's not. It's just an individual.
It's just individuals that
wow.
started this, and that's a little bit the problem because typically you need at least one party support, ideally 2 or 3 parties that support it to actually have enough people who care about a topic.
But that's even more impressive that a group of people who doesn't represent a party is able to collect that many signatures.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, they exceeded 100,000 by far.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that's fascinating. So I guess my question is in the context of Switzerland being quite innovative. I mean, you mentioned, Jamie, that the central bank has already signaled that they're not really super interested right now in going to a digital currency. But when you look at the broad scope of how direct democracy works in Switzerland, and at the same time, the level of innovation, Switzerland always top in the innovation index around the world. I guess how do you see direct democracy playing a role in, I guess, the development of Switzerland when it comes to new technologies, but at the same time, I guess, ensuring that there's less discrimination even in the financial markets or payment systems? Do you see that as a trend, that the direct democracy will help in the innovation? Or do you think that it could hinder it because people don't like things or are too afraid?
I think those two are very separate topics. So direct democracy certainly provides a legal framework that provides safety, security, and sustainability, which is also one of the reasons why the financial industry is blooming here in Switzerland, because people have a lot of legal security. Because nothing is going to change overnight in Switzerland. Everything takes its time. Everything is typically thought through. Everything has been voted on. So there's no nasty, quick surprises. So that's certainly helpful in terms of providing innovation. Also, there's a level of safety where people have certain social benefits where they are more able to take on risk and for example, start their own firm because there's only so far they can fall financially. But I think the reason Switzerland is so fantastic, actually a world leader in innovation, is because of fantastic universities that we have here. For example, ETH is worldwide known as one of the top universities in the world. They are excellent in a lot of topics, for example, robotics, where they invest a lot of times. They attract talent from all over the world who want to study there. We have low to free costs of university for local people. We have a huge pharma industry which invests a lot in research and development. We have one of the highest patent to person ratios in the world. So I think we can be proud of our innovation. Maybe sometimes our culture prohibits us from shouting it from the rooftop. We're more maybe sometimes a bit timid, maybe a little bit more conservative also with announcing how innovative we are. But I don't really think that there's a super direct correlation between innovation and direct democracy. I think they are two different concepts. Both are important to our culture and our country, but not necessarily so intertwined.
And I think that we are in an environment where innovation is, what does it mean? Like they want innovation to happen. So, for example, in 2020, the Swiss National Bank, the Bank for International Settlement Innovation Hub, it's a certain department there, and the Swiss Stock Exchange, they had a project together. It was called Project Helvetia, where they looked at the central bank digital currencies. And they looked at this in a way of how can they make the processes better, how can they improve like the efficiency, how can they improve like the whole system. But what was interesting was that they did not look on like the individual level, but on the institutional level. So that is something which has to be distinguished from each other. So on one side we have the retail, central bank digital currency, and on the other hand we have the wholesale part of it. And the retail part is really like when it comes down to the people, and the wholesale CBDC is about the system between the institutions. And this study shows that they really look at this development in a way, how can we benefit out of it, and how can we like serve our people in this environment. And I think that's an important part, so that they don't look, okay, what kind of data can we get out of it, what kind of political advantage or whatever can we get out of it. And also one of the directors of the Swiss National Bank in its summary said, okay, look, there are certain parts that central bank can do, but that doesn't mean that it should do it.
That's really fascinating to hear a central bank saying that.
Yeah.
You know, often, at least getting used to the Fed can do everything, and so that's fascinating to hear. I hadn't read that, and so that's really interesting.
But I think that goes back to what we were talking about with the debt ceiling, that also the central bank in Switzerland is more detached from politics. It is really an independent, non-political institution, whereas from my understanding, the Fed is more tied to politics because the president is also appointing the Fed chair. So I think that's also, again, like speaking to this separation, this like Chinese wall between different institutions that we don't necessarily see as much in the US.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I like that the Swiss National Bank is given one directive of price stability. I think that really allows it to separate from politics. And I think what often, not only the appointing of the Fed chair by the president, but also pulls the Fed more into politics, is that they have to worry about the employment level. Yes. And so they, have to, if the government is the great employer, then they have to try to make it work for the government, or whoever's the great employer. The Fed has to kind of try to pick sides and parse things out instead of just looking at how do we control the price stability. And I think that's something that Switzerland does really, really well. So do you guys have any final thoughts on this cash initiative that you would like to share for the clients? Any thoughts?
Well, I think I like the direction that this initiative is taking. One thing that I saw is that they have already planned a second referendum where they want to force companies or like public institutions to accept cash. So like they can also accept cards, but they have to accept cash. Personally, I think that is taking it a step too far because it's interfering with entrepreneurial freedom. And I believe every restaurant and bar owner can decide if they only want to accept cards and digital payments. I mean, that's up to them. And then if you as a client or a customer don't want to adhere to that, it's up to you to not give them your money. So I don't think this like cash option should go as far as to cut into people's entrepreneurial freedom. But if it's just about keeping the government accountable and have them like have them be forced to keep the cash option available, then I think it's a good development. And I like that Switzerland is taking that stance of keeping the freedom of people and letting them choose how they want to pay, and letting them have their freedom of not having every single transaction being digitally recorded.
Yeah, I can totally agree to that. It's really, I mean, that's one of the strengths in Switzerland, that we have a lot of like freedom when it comes to our entrepreneurial spirit, and that we can do a lot of it. And I mean, you don't have to go to a restaurant or whatever. And I think it is important that like the authorities in Switzerland, that they do not nudge the companies or the restaurants into a direction that they only accept digital payment, but that they just provide the platform, the system for everything, for cash, for digital payments. And so at the end, it will be up to the individual to decide what he takes and what he goes with.
Cool. Thank you guys so much for today. Thank you for this discussion. And I'm looking forward to our next podcast where we sit together. And we're excited for you listeners. If you enjoy our content, whack a like on the YouTube video. Otherwise, thank you for joining in, and we're excited to see you come back to the next episode. Thanks again for joining us on this episode of the Swiss Money Secrets podcast. If you would like to learn more about WHVP and what we do, check us out on our website at WHVP.ch. Or you can check us out on any of our social media handles on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, or Instagram by simply searching WHVP. Have a great rest of your day.